And good morning and welcome to WellMed Charitable Foundation's Caregiver Teleconnection. Today we have a presentation entitled Defining Caregiving and defining caregivers and recognizing their experiences with our incredible experts, Elliot Montgomery Sklar, who is a public health professional with 2 decades of experience in supporting the health of the public through academic work, research, and service. And I have to go back. It's Dr. Elliot Montgomery Sklar, as he has his doctorate in public health. He has led healthy aging programs for seniors and for caregivers in Canada, Florida, and virtually. And his research is focused on the complexity of issues related to aging and caregiving. Dr. Sklar is an associate professor of healthcare sciences at Nova Southeastern University in Florida. He publishes and presents his work internationally. Recently, he's published research in the American Journal of Occupational Therapy, the Journal of Applied Gerontology, and the Journal of Social Services Research. Now, Lucy Barylak has a master's degree in social work from McGill University. She is presently working as a consultant for a health network in Montreal, Canada. She's been involved in various research projects and has published numerous articles related to caregiving issues. She's lectured at several universities and colleges on innovative approaches to caregiving and presents annually at international and national conferences. Lucy's also a consultant for private industry in the United States, including her work with the WellMed Charitable Foundation and their clinics in Texas. In addition, Lucy would like you to know that she was a caregiver for her mother for about 10 years. And with that, Lucy, Elliot, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I don't want you to get the impression that we have the wrong set of slides because of the title. Today's program is about defining caregivers and recognizing their roles. It's part 1 in a 3-part series that we've created called Engaging Caregivers, which is really just that, a way to help train healthcare workers on how to engage caregivers more formally into care planning, and also to take into account the experiences of caregivers and their well-being. So for those of you who are healthcare workers, if you are registered today and if you do want to receive a certificate of attendance, you can do so by sending a quick email to the email at the bottom of your screen. We will also be sending out a copy of today's slides for everyone. But I wanted to go over what our hopes are for our program today. And really it's to describe family caregivers and their challenges, also to discuss the role of family caregivers in care planning, as I said, to review some of the physical and mental health issues among caregivers. Very important right now is to discuss addiction as well, and to identify self-care resources, which we will provide throughout our program and as a resource to you all after today's program. Whoops, Lucy, you're on mute.
Well, thank you for that. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our session today. You know, I really want to talk about frontline workers, healthcare workers. You are the backbone of effective health system. You know, they are often based in community and come from the community they serve. You know, they play a big role in providing services, solutions, referrals, and prevention to families, individuals, caregivers, and care receivers. So during the pandemic, the role of caregivers gained new attention, and the role became even more crucial. We know, however, that the role of healthcare workers is focused on patient care and patient-centered outcomes. Often little focus is paid to the role of caregivers in supporting these patient-centered outcomes, and this is the focus of our motivation and creating these series to support healthcare workers.
Now I was on mute. So it's pretty astounding, but there really has been no new research published since 2020 about caregiving in the US. And I would really like to see some new research given how things might have changed as a result of the pandemic. We know that the Caregiving in the US report, for those of you who don't know, is a report that comes out coordinated by the National Alliance for Caregiving and AARP. And it's really the most comprehensive report we have nationally about the state of affairs for caregivers. Now, the results of the 2020 study showed an increase in the number of family caregivers by 9.5 million from 2015 to 2020. That's pretty staggering. Now, that's the newest data I mentioned, which is from 2020. But as putting this presentation together, I was thinking about how COVID might have changed that. And estimates now indicate that 70% of Americans have had COVID, 70%. But we aren't quite sure what percentage of those people have long-haul COVID symptoms. Estimates are about 10% of people. So if you imagine that 70% of Americans have had COVID and now 10% of that 70% has long-haul COVID, that may have changed people's ability to provide care or even to need more care. So according to this report, which I think is still very relevant today, the majority of caregivers are baby boomers, but more and more younger adults are becoming caregivers. And there are a lot of issues related to millennial caregiving because of differences in generational perspectives about life, responsibility. It's a very actually complex issue. Reports also indicate that about 61% of women are caregivers and 39% of men. But we know that there may be some underreporting there. Men are less likely to report themselves as being caregivers. Now, there are also a lot of financial inequities for caregivers. Roughly 61% of them work, according to this report, and 45% have had at least one financial impact as a result of their caregiving role. For example, being passed up for a promotion at work or needing to take time off. And we also know that there are inequities among diverse caregiver populations and even between men and women, which are themes that we'll focus upon in our last session in this series of 3. We also know that demographics continue to change. More divorced adults potentially mean more people growing older alone. We see that this is certainly true for women and that older women more commonly live alone. But I could attribute this also to the fact that life expectancy between men and women is different and women are expected to live longer. As our life expectancy increases, we will also need more support in aging. And as many of us know, the longest source of long-term care support comes from informal family caregivers. And I'm very excited to show this video, and I hope that the sound will work. Let's see.
To be her ears and her voice and her eyes because she didn't speak English or couldn't read English. But things got very difficult when she needed a lot more care. And she started to have an awful lot of medical problems. She was diagnosed with diabetes. She had heart condition. She had arthritis. She had a stroke. And then she even had some cognitive impairment. I really found myself at that point becoming a hands-on caregiver. But I was working full-time in the healthcare profession. I was married at the time and had 2 children. And kind of my life kind of got out of whack, really, because I was trying to juggle everything. Even though I was a professional and knew a lot about caregiving issues, there was a tremendous denial on my part. And I think a lot of caregivers do have denial. I didn't really want to accept the fact that my mom could not do what she used to do before. And it's really quite a big transition to finally recognize, you know what, I'm not just a daughter, I'm her caregiver. I have to be there for her. The burden of caregiving is tremendous, and if you don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, it can become very, very stressful. I realized that I needed time for myself. I needed respite. Most of the time I was thinking about her needs, but then I recognized that I had my own needs. And if I wasn't able to sort of step away from the situation, I would be overwhelmed and burned out very quickly. Caregivers feel a lot of sadness, and you can understand why, because they're caring for someone that they loved. And all of a sudden that person is no longer the person that they knew before. Most of them feel the fact that they can't be there all the time to support their family member makes them feel very guilty. And just to see the person that you care for so much going through such difficult times, it's sad, it's depressing, and it's very hard to get over that. But it's important to allow yourself to at least acknowledge it and realize where it's coming from. You kind of need to get some control over that. It's very important to be able to ask for help, first of all. There is a lot of help out there, and to seek it out, whether it's going to a support group, whether it's going individual counseling. But one of the most important thing also is having the education to understand the disease that your family member is going through, the stages and what to expect, so that you can actually look at your short-term goals, long-term goals, and how to handle them, so that you don't feel, oh my God, I don't know what's going on, and really feel literally empowered by getting that information. It is a positive way of handling a situation like that. Well, well, that was me if anyone didn't recognize me with my very, very blonde hair. Before we go any further, I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions that you would like to ask of me. Um, I did that because I felt it was important to tell my story. And as you heard, even though I seem to know what the resources, and being a healthcare worker, being a caregiver really puts you in a different dimension.
Isn't that the truth? So folks, if you're on the phone, please press *6. I'll be able to see that your phone is unmuted. If you're on Zoom, please just unmute yourself and I'll recognize you. I'd love to have your input. It's so important.
Especially since I was finally able to get the audio to work on that clip. So it's a very powerful video, and it really encapsulates a lot of, I think, what we try to convey.
And you're wonderful on it, Lucy.
Thank you. I think the important part of this video and what Elliot and I are trying to do today is to really look at, each one of us as a healthcare worker needs to look at, our caregivers a resource? Are they a partner? Are they a client? You know, has been largely demonstrated through research and working in the field that without the support of family and friends, majority are mainly women, as we know, it would be impossible to maintain people with major disabilities in the community. We know that family caregivers pay an important, they pay an important price at all levels for their involvement in providing care. Most models of care and service delivery regard caregivers as a resource. I mean, that's a given, okay? For maintaining frail elderly or those with any form of dementia or physical difficulties at home. Some healthcare providers feel that caregivers should be performing those duties, regardless of how many tasks are involved in the care, as well as many perceive that it is the family's duty to provide care. There's also an expectation of caregivers, many times, to develop skills and knowledge around nursing, rehabilitation, treatments, and equipment maintenance. And many caregivers themselves don't see themselves as caregivers, only as a wife, a husband, a partner, a child, etc. So in order to support and make sure that caregivers care for themselves, healthcare workers are the key in providing, identifying, and advocating for caregivers' rights. Caregivers need to maintain their own well-being in order to care for their loved ones. I want to share a research that we did in my organization. It was a home care service center. And so we did a study, and what the research found is that 3 roles were identified, what you see on the slides. Most saw them as resources for sure. Some, very few, saw them as partners, and very, very few saw them as clients. So I would like to go over, like, what do I mean by a resource? What do I mean by a partner and a client? So a resource provides the right resources at the right time, which sort of tells me that it's like, it could be always, or 24 hours. A partnership is an arrangement where partners agree to cooperate and advance their mutual interests, being equal in decision making. That's the key word, being equal in decision making. And obviously, a client is a person who needs services. So, are caregivers a resource? Is it right to expect caregivers to be a resource? In certain circumstances, and if the caregiver is able and willing to perform certain daily tasks, then yes. However, when the caregiver cannot, because of their own limitations, their age, or their unwillingness, then whose responsibility is it? I think that we all need to look into our own value system, our cultural background to answer those questions for ourselves. So, for example, do we expect, excuse me, a daughter who is capable to perform certain nursing tasks for her mother, like learning how to give insulin shots? I want to share my own personal experience. You know, at one point, my mother needed insulin shots, and the doctor and nurse felt that I should be trained to perform those tasks. No one asked me if I was willing to do so or did I have the time to do so. They just assumed, as a daughter, it was expected. I have fear of needles and could not imagine to actually giving my mother a shot and possibly hurting her. I said no, and I could see how they were looking at me. They were judging me, really, and I felt very in a very difficult position. It would have been really, really wonderful if one of them would have said, "Why are you saying no? What's the reason behind it?" So let's continue. So what are your thoughts about caregivers as a resource? Do you see caregivers as a resource? Do you have any thoughts around that? I would really appreciate hearing from you.
Again, folks, if you're on the phone, all you need to do is press *6. If you're on Zoom, just unmute yourself and I'll be able to see you on my website and call upon you. And Lucy, I just want to say I'm an old discharge planner from the hospital. And so much of what's happened in the last 20 years has made caregivers into medical staff, basically. You know, they're using equipment, they're giving shots, you know, they're using Hoyer lifts, you know, things that people used to go to skilled nursing for. So it's caregivers now that they're assuming will do that. And they don't offer training many times, you know, caregivers have to ask for it.
And it's also very dangerous to ask someone who's not trained to do certain things, like a Hoyer lift. They can hurt themselves. Since we don't have any comments on that, it's okay, because it's really something that a lot of people many times kind of thinking, you know, I haven't really thought about it in that perspective. So I think it's just important to, in the field that you're working with, it's just to look at yourself and sort of question it's not only you, it's the agency's policy and what are the expectations of caregivers when providing services. Okay. So let's I also want to look at, are caregivers a partner? If so, what does partnership mean? Being equal in decision making. The important thing is to keep in mind that the caregiver knows their loved one better than anyone else, but they also know their limitations. It's important in a partnership to ask the person what they need or what they feel they can manage to actually do. So caregivers should be involved in any decision, in organizing any services or any plan of intervention. And I do have to say that negotiation is the key factor in any partnership relationship. So that's a partnership. And so many times I have to say, in a lot of organizations, including my own when I was working, where a plan of intervention was made, decisions were made, and call up the caregiver and say, okay, according to the budget or whatever the rules were, you're entitled to this, this, and this. But wouldn't it be interesting and wouldn't it be helpful if the caregiver was part of that decision making? And I really see a change in that. I do have to say that in many organizations, they do include the caregiver. But if you don't in yours or in your own practice, please look at it in a different perspective. And the other thing is, can anyone give us an example of how you negotiated with the caregiver and providing the care for their loved one? I'd love to hear from you.
Okay, folks, just press *6 or unmute yourself. If you're on Zoom, would love to hear your experiences. They always help us out.
I think people are really thinking about it.
Well, you've given them a lot to think about, Lucy. Your own experiences particularly really hit home.
Yeah. Well, again, it really boils down to just sort of kind of looking at it as a whole package, you know, because the next thing is, as I said, some of the healthcare workers did identify caregivers as a client, potential client, because if after what Elliot was telling us with research and what's going on, there's almost an expectation that they might be a client. Since we know that caregivers are at a high risk for burnout, depression, physical and mental disorders, we need to be mindful that they may need help as well. So being a client means that they hopefully will receive support, possible services when needed, and the expectations that are associated with caregiving will be somewhat diminished for them. So as a client, they also are given permission to care for themselves. Now, there is a bit of a issue here as well, because if you're a client, you need to open a file, okay? And in many organizations, that's an issue with stats, and if there's a certain regulations, and it also means that there's more work for the individual healthcare provider. And that in itself is something that needs to be really looked at in an organization. So can anyone explain, and we'll try it one more time, why we need to consider caregivers as potential clients, besides what I said? Do you believe that we should consider caregivers potential client?
Folks, just press *6 on your phone or unmute yourself. We would love to hear from you. Lucy, you know, one of the things I love today, oh, wait, area code 231, please go ahead.
Yes, I believe that we should involve the caregivers because they're an integral part. If we're teaching them and they're not willing to do something, then things won't get done. But I also believe that people need to advocate for themselves, and they need to speak up and say, hey, I'm not able to do this, and this is why. And that way they can work together to find something that would work.
That is such an important thing that you just brought up, advocating. We're going to be doing a series. That's one of the things we're going to be talking about. Yes, we really encourage caregivers to advocate for themselves, because if you're just going to accept everything that's being said to you, and you don't speak up, how's that healthcare worker supposed to know that you're not able to, or maybe not even willing to? So it's an extremely good point that you just made. And thank you for that.
Anybody else? Love to hear from you. I was just going to make a comment, Lucy, that one of the things I loved about the fairly recent trauma-informed interviewing is that the first question is, what do you need?
Right. We always ask healthcare workers the same question. That was one of the things that Elliot is always very in tune to, is to ask, what do you need? We all need to ask ourselves, what do we need in order to perform our task, or even in our daily lives? I see something on, somebody sent something.
Yes.
I work for a Jewish family service, and we're trying to create a caregiver support program for family caregivers. So in this way, I can see caregivers as clients.
Excellent, amazing. I love group therapy. I think I've worked in that. We did research on that. It's not for everyone, but it's such a powerful service to provide people the opportunity to come together and share and be able to see that you're not alone in what you're feeling and get very, very personal. Allow yourself to be honest. So good luck with that. Thank you.
I think also if you consider professional oaths, within different fields, they are not only to do no harm, but to help. And if you see that a caregiver is going through a tough time in their role, I kind of feel like it's part of that oath that you take to try to help that person.
Interesting point.
Very, very, very important point that you're making, Elliot.
Well, you both kind of preemptively talked about self-care, but I think that's a good segue for us to talk about that. Because as we know, caring for ourselves is critical, and I think it's something we all need to practice more of. We hear this all the time, and we know this, but somehow we don't practice what we preach. And I think that this is especially true for healthcare workers. After all, there's a reason why we go into the helping field to help others. So sometimes when our career is to focus on the welfare of others, we lose sight that we need to do that for ourselves. And I usually ask this question of caregivers that tends to make people feel a little uneasy. And I'm going to ask it to all of you right now. And you touched upon this, Evelyn, earlier. But what do you need to feel taken care of today? Does anyone have any thoughts?
What do you need as a caregiver? Is that what you're asking?
As a person,
As a
what
person.
you need to feel taken care of instead of taking care of others.
Good question. Come on, folks.
Well, I'll give them a few seconds. I think that if I think back when I was working, what I needed really from my organization was feeling supported. Feeling supported, feeling when I was, caring for my mother as well, I needed to feel that I can go to my director and be honest about what I needed, that I needed a little bit more understanding in the sense that I was a caregiver and trying to do my job as well.
It's interesting. Most HR departments have become much more familiar with caregiving issues, I think, over the last 10 or 15 years.
Absolutely.
Anybody? Come on, we want to hear from you.
It's okay. It's a heavy question because it's not something that we often think about.
We have a comment from Pierre. He says it's family support and time away from the role.
Absolutely.
Respite.
Balance is so important. But it's important to think about, that old adage of being on an airplane and an oxygen mask descends in front of you. What do you do? And the first rule is to put on your own mask before you help others. And really only when we help ourselves first can we effectively help others. So I think caring for yourself is very important. As a college professor, I often include self-care assignments within my courses. And I ask students to report back on what they did and how it made them feel. Because I do teach future healthcare workers, and I think it's important that we sort of get in the practice of that.
I just saw a comment from Pierre that he said, I learned that the hard way. Love to hear what you meant by that.
Do you want to talk to us, Pierre? Well, I can tell you one thing. Many caregivers I know wait too long to figure out that they need help. Oh, he's got a noisy background. But Yeah, if we can learn something from Pierre's comment, it's not to wait too long. It's to make a plan for our respite, make a plan for ourselves where we can get away. Right? He says he waited too long. Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't want to wait too long because then, we get all that cortisol, we get depression, we get anxiety. We feel like we're not doing things well enough. We don't want to feel like that.
Oops, what just happened? Hold on. There we go. Sorry about that.
You're the best, Elliot.
Pierre had added to his comment that he waited too long and it took a toll on him physically, mentally, but he's glad that he has a supportive wife and inner circle, and I'm glad to hear that too.
Thank you for that, Pierre.
So that's a very good lead in to our next segment of today's program, which talks a lot about family caregiver health concerns, but this is also true for healthcare workers quite often. We know a lot about the effects of caregiving on health and well-being. For example, if you're a spouse caring for someone between the ages of 66 and 96, and are experiencing mental or emotional strain, there is research that shows that your risk of dying is higher, significantly higher than non-caregivers. The combination of loss, prolonged stress, physical demands involved with caregiving, and also the biological vulnerabilities that come with age often place caregivers at risk for significant health problems and an earlier death. Now, older caregivers are not the only ones who put their health and well-being at risk. If you're a baby boomer, for example, who has assumed a caregiver role for your parents while simultaneously juggling work and raising children, much like the video, Lucy, of you speaking of your earlier experience, there is an increased risk for depression, which you talked about, but also chronic illness and a possible decline in quality of life. Now, despite these risks, family caregivers of any age are less likely than non-caregivers to practice preventative health care and other self-care behavior. And that's true regardless of age, sex, race, or ethnicity. Caregivers report problems attending to their own health and well-being while having to manage multiple responsibilities. Often, caregivers report sleep deprivation, poor eating habits, failure to exercise, which we know is so important, failure to stay in bed when they're sick, and postponement of or failure to make medical appointments for themselves. Now, caregivers are also more likely to have chronic illness than non-caregivers, specifically high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and a tendency to be more overweight. That would make sense if we're not exercising and eating well. There are some studies that show that at about 46% to 59% of caregivers are clinically depressed. So that's significant. So it's important to ask family caregivers that you might be working with, what do you need to feel taken care of? And how are you feeling? And also to remind them of the importance of self-care. I think if we leave today with one lesson, it's how very important the role of self-care is, in addition to identifying how we all come together to help people. We have another comment in the chat. Yes, to Jay Walker, we will be providing a copy of our presentation today. Please be sure that you registered for our program, and Evelyn will talk more about that as we wrap up. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about taking responsibility for our own care. And this applies to healthcare workers and family caregivers. You know, many times we think that our attitudes and beliefs form barriers and they stand in the way for caring for ourselves. It's important to remember that not taking care of yourself might be a lifelong pattern, might be something that you saw among your parents growing up. Instead of focusing on taking care of, of ourselves, we take care of others. So I'm sure that this sounds familiar to some of our healthcare workers, but it's really important to break old patterns and overcome obstacles. No, it's not easy, regardless of age, situation. The first task in removing personal barriers to self-care is to identify what's in your way. For example, A lot of people think that self-care is selfish. And you might want to ask yourself if you think that it's being selfish to put your needs first, or frightening perhaps to think of your own needs. Will you feel inadequate perhaps if you need to ask for help? Do you do too much as a result? Sometimes caregivers do have misconceptions that increase their stress and get in the way of good self-care. And what I'm saying to all of you healthcare workers is true for caregivers too. And it's important to remind ourselves of this, that self-care isn't selfish. Now, it's important, I think, that we remember to practice this as much as we can. And we have some self-care practice basics that might be helpful. First and foremost is always attending to our healthcare needs. If you haven't had a physical, go and get one. If you haven't had a COVID booster this year, we'll talk more about that in future sessions relating back to COVID, but it might be time to consider getting a booster. It's important to get proper rest and nutrition and exercise. Exercise is proven to help combat all of those things I was talking about: anxiety, depression, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, even if it's only for 10 minutes. It's important also to take time off when you need it. I believe it's important that we take mental health days. Sometimes we just need a day off for ourselves. It's not something that we should feel guilty about. It's important to participate in pleasant, nurturing activities and to seek the support of others, as Pierre was sharing in his chat. It's also important to seek counseling when you need it. And if those of you participating today don't yet know, we do in the US have a new hotline. It's 988, and you can call that number anytime you need to talk to a crisis counselor or a mental health counselor. It is free. There is no information, and it's available from any phone. So again, that's 988.
Hopefully it'll be working.
Yeah. Listen, anytime anything new starts, there's always some bumps in the road.
Always some glitches, yes.
Always. It's like you don't want to go to a restaurant the grand opening week, But I have faith.
Yeah.
I have faith.
Elliot, I'm not a Zoom expert, but I saw a phone come up and I'm wondering if Javi wants to talk to us. Javi, are you there? Would you like to say something to us? Maybe it's Javi, because I'm from San Diego. Javi is usually short for Javier.
Same in South Florida.
Okay, maybe not. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I did notice that there was an unmuted line, but it seemed like perhaps it was a mistake. Certainly, we invite your comments in the chat, or to unmute your lines as we go. But it's just, I think as we shared this slide presentation, if you want to print this one out and post it to your fridge and think of something each day that you can do, sometimes putting Post-it notes around as reminders is helpful. If you just take 2 minutes out of your day to do something good for yourself, it's a good start. You can set goals.
Well, thank you for that, Elliot. We spoke a lot about the physical aspects of caregiving. I want to focus a little bit on the psychological health of family caregivers. It is negatively affected by providing care. There's no ifs or buts about that. There are higher levels of stress, anxiety, depression, and other mental health effects are common among family members who care for an older relative or a friend or any form of caregiving. Studies consistently report higher levels of depression, symptoms, and mental health problems among caregivers, and a lot more than their non-caregiving peers. Estimates show that between 40 to 70% of caregivers have clinically significant symptoms of depression, with approximately 1/4 to 1/2 of these caregivers meeting the diagnostic criteria for major depression. That means they're not really functioning. Both caregiver depression and perceived burden increase as the care receiver's functional status declines. So if they have dementia and they're going downhill, it's normal to see those levels of anxiety, depression going up in the caregiver. So those higher levels of clinical depression are attributed to people caring for individuals with dementia. Studies show that 30 to 40% of dementia caregivers suffer from depression and emotional stress. So depression and anxiety disorders found in caregivers persist and can even worsen after the placement of a loved one in a nursing home. That was a little bit surprising. Many caregivers who institutionalize their relatives report depressive symptoms and anxiety to be high, as it was when the care was in the home. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but there are definitely reasons for that. Maybe the caregiver has isolated themselves before that, and they're sort of feeling really alone and just being very, very unproductive, or just feeling depressed. Caregivers are more likely to they have anxiety as well with depression, substance abuse, or dependence, and chronic disease. Depression is also one of the most common conditions associated with suicide attempts. So I think it's really, really important for healthcare workers to be able to recognize. Caregivers suffer from higher levels of stress and frustration. Caregivers have higher levels of stress than non-caregivers. They also describe feeling frustrated, angry, drained, guilty, or helpless as a result of providing care. You know, some 16% of caregivers feel emotionally strained, and 26 say taking care of a care recipient is hard on them emotionally. Additionally, 13% of caregivers feel frustrated with the lack of progress made with the care recipient. Caregiving can also result in a feeling of loss of self-identity, levels of self-esteem, constant worry, feelings of uncertainty. Caregivers have less self-acceptance and feel less effective and less in control of their lives than non-caregivers. More than one-fifth, 22% of caregivers are exhausted when they go to sleep at night, and many feel they cannot handle all their caregiving responsibilities. Caregivers who experience chronic stress may be at a greater risk for cognitive decline, including loss in short-term memory, attention, and even verbal IQ, believe it or not. So I want to talk, since we know that a lot of caregiving is done by women, kind of want to focus a little bit on the health consequences for women caregivers. So research shows that female caregivers, about 2/3 of all unpaid caregivers, fare worse than their male counterparts, reporting high levels of depression and anxiety symptoms and lower levels of subjective well-being, life satisfaction, and physical health than male caregivers. So according to one study, there is a dramatic increase in the risk of mental health consequences among women who provide 36 or more hours per week of care to a spouse or anyone else. In a national survey on caregiver health, more than 1 in 5, 21% women surveyed had mammogram less often. So what they're actually saying is that they are not taking care of themselves. Stressful caregiving situations may lead to harmful behavior. As a response to increased stress, caregivers are shown to have increased alcohol and other substance use. Several studies have shown that caregivers use prescription and over-the-counter drugs more than non-caregivers. Family caregivers are at a higher risk for higher levels of hostility than non-caregivers. Spousal caregivers who are at risk of clinical depression and are caring for a spouse or a partner with significant cognitive impairment or physical care needs are more likely to engage in harmful behavior towards their loved one. I want to tell you that we're having the next session, I think it's the next one or the third, we're going to talk about elder abuse. And when I talk about elder abuse, it could be the caregiver being abusive or the care receiver being abusive to the caregiver. And that's really, really important to be able to identify that. So
It's next
family.
Wednesday.
Thank you.
Next Wednesday, Lucy.
Thank you for that. Family caregivers are also at an increased risk for excessive use of alcohol, tobacco, other drugs. Caregivers can be they're on an emotional roller coaster ride. On one hand, caring for your family member demonstrates love and commitment and could be very rewarding and personal experience. On the other hand, exhaustion, worry, inadequate resources, and continuous care demands are enormously stressful. So as a healthcare worker, it's very important to be aware that caregivers and their loved ones may be suffering from any form of addiction. I want to very briefly, I'm just looking at the time, discuss like what is addiction, okay? And I want to emphasize to everyone that addiction is a disease, okay? In the past, people often spoke about addiction as a lack of willpower, as a selfish act, as an expression of weakness. This is not the case. Addiction is a disease that over time can physically change a person's brain. Okay, that's important to keep in mind. The way they behave and act, and even aspects of their personality. So personality changes. It does really affect your brain. This disease can have both physical and major psychological repercussions. The disease of addiction must be treated like you would treat diabetes or any other illness, and involves a treatment plan and good support system. All right. So I just want to talk a little bit more about statistics just for a minute. Substance use disorders among older persons are among the fastest growing health problem in the United States, according to a research done in 2020. That's really something to really keep in mind. Moreover, the prevalence of substance use disorders remains high in the baby boomer generation as they age into later life, with substance abuse including drugs such as alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, prescription medication, especially painkillers, I have to say, shopping addiction, gambling, cyber addiction, and sometimes even binge eating, sex, and others. Okay. So, healthcare workers need to be vigilant and ask the right questions without judgment. If you suspect that someone is displaying signs of addiction, it could be for, the caregiver, or it could be the person that they're caring for. So let's look at what are the signs of addiction. Now, that's kind of a basic rules, but there could be others as well. Lack of control, decreased socialization, they're isolating themselves, they're withdrawing, they're not really talking as much. Changes in sleeping habits, they sleep too much, they don't sleep at all. Chronic fatigue is a big one. Constant illness, they're really sick a lot of the times. Injuries, okay, because they're dizzy and they're falling, or they're physically abusive, vice versa. Physical changes, believe it or not, the skin gets bad. There's, either pimples are popping up or rashes, hair loss, even teeth, you know, they're just, that a lot of things happen in your mouth that affects the rest of the body. Nails, you could see changes in color of nails. There's definitely memory loss. There's depression, obviously. And as I said before, aggressive behavior. They just don't care. They're really apathetic. So these are things that as healthcare workers, we really have to keep our eyes open, because believe it or not, it's very, very easy to get addictive very, very quickly. So I kind of want to open it up for questions or comments or anything that anybody would like to share at this point. And then I'm going to pass it over to you, Evelyn, because you always have some business to share with us.
Yes. So folks, press star 6 if you're on the phone. Just unmute yourself, and I have a website. I can see who has done that. I just want you to know that we really enjoy hearing from our participants very much. We've learned so much from them from all of you over the years. And we encourage you to unmute or to press star 6.
Such an important topic, addiction. Did someone have a comment?
if I may just sort of add, I'm kind of looking at the time as well. We also did some studies about addiction that relates to healthcare workers. I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Nobody should be embarrassed or um, things happen in life. There's no blame there. If you yourself feel that for whatever reason, you might be one of these people that is heading towards an addiction or is addicted to alcohol or even over the counter medications like pain pills or prescription medication. I know that it sounds like even shopping, it is an addiction if you cannot control it. Then please seek out the help. We're all humans. We make mistakes. And it's so important to look at ourselves as well.
Well, I can't thank you folks enough. This was extremely interesting. I don't have anybody with an open line, so I'm going to go ahead and just do a little cleanup work here. I want folks to know that in a couple of days, you'll receive a post-session questionnaire. Now, that questionnaire will come along with all of the resources that we've talked about today. And look at that, wonderful Minerva's. But is that you or is that you, Elliot? The resources
are always included resources.
Yes, Elliot's the resource master. But you won't get those unless you're registered today. So please call our customer service representative, the wonderful Minerva, at 866-390-6491. You'll not only get the resources for today, but you'll be on the list to get the calendars for the coming months, which are rich in topics and experts and information that it's so important to have for caregivers. Now, when you get the questionnaire, we really ask you to take a minute and fill it out because it helps us to continue to improve what we're trying to do here. Now, I want to thank our expert speakers for such a beautiful job today. I want to thank all the caregivers because, of course, you are the backbone of long-term care in the world. And I want to tell you about some of our new sessions, which is always hard at the beginning of the month because there are so many. It's easier the last day of the month when there aren't any left. Next Wednesday, we're going to have difficult such situations and elder abuse with Lucy and Elliot. And the following Wednesday, August 17th, we're going to have diversity in caregiving. So those are the two of their series that they're going to complete. Excuse me. Let's see, tomorrow's Thursday, and we're going to have the ABCs of frontotemporal dementias with Tam Cummings. On Monday, August 8th, we're going to have hospice and palliative care. On Tuesday, August 9th, we're going to have late life depression and dementia with Dr. Nestor Praderio. And for those who have not heard him before, it's like talking to St. Francis or something. He's just so passionate and compassionate that you'll love hearing from him. On the 13th, we've got a cool one by Lucy. And that is, not the 13th, sorry, the 11th, how music can help people with dementia. That'll be a really fun one, Lucy. And then on August 25th, we've got high conflict relationships and its impact on you as a caregiver, which is really important for those family relationships. And that's with Dr. Jamie Heisman. On Friday, August 26th, we have a Spanish one. And if you are on the list for Spanish calendars, you will already know that. And if you're not, please call our customer service person at 866-390-6491 and get on that Spanish list. And on Tuesday, August 30th, we're going to have dementia and the hidden patient. So all of those sound so interesting and amazing. I'm going to sign up for all of them. And I thank you all so much. And Elliot, Lucy, final words.
Thank you so much for being with us and take care.
Elliot?
It's the muting unmuting day. Just wanted to thank everyone so much for joining us and hope you join us next week. We will be talking about handling difficult situations, elder abuse, advocacy, and more.
Great. I want to thank you all so much for what you do, And I hope that you're with us next week and in many of our presentations in the future. And I'm going to stop the recording now and say goodbye. Stay safe.
Thank you for this session.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for
Thank you.
joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.